Evelyn Blake had always been a city girl. The constant hum of Boston's traffic, the glow of streetlights flickering against the night, and the bustle of crowded coffee shops were the soundtrack of her life. As a nurse, her world was clinical, controlled, and predictable. It was the kind of life she could manage until she couldn't anymore. She hadn't felt whole in months. The sterile walls of the hospital, the constant weight of patient care, and the undercurrent of sadness that always followed her, had begun to suffocate her. It had started after the death of her mother, a loss that had left a jagged hole in her chest, a hole that no amount of busy shifts or hospital procedures could fill. She had tried therapy, but the loneliness in the room with the therapist was somehow worse than the isolation she felt in her own home. And then, one day, it came. A letter. Thin, elegant, and stamped with an official seal. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, from a place she didn't even know existed. The letter opened with a name she barely recognized. Marjorie Blake. You are the sole inheritor of Croft House, located in Merrow's Hollow, Vermont. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to discuss the details. Evelyn had stared at the words for an hour, trying to make sense of them. Her great-aunt Marjorie? The name rang no bells. There had never been mention of an aunt, much less one who lived in some obscure town in Vermont. Yet the documents that followed were too official to ignore. It seemed her great-aunt had lived and died in a place called Croft House, and now it was hers. Despite her doubts, Evelyn knew she needed to get away. The hospital, the grief, the suffocating loneliness, everything was closing in. The idea of a new beginning, however strange, was a pull she couldn't resist. A week later, Evelyn found herself standing on the front porch of Croft House, the late autumn chill biting into her skin. The house loomed in front of her, almost skeletal against the gray sky. Its stone facade was chipped and weather-worn, the windows covered in grime. The air was still, but there was a strange heaviness to it, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Merrow's Hollow, the town nearest to the house, felt like a ghost of a place. No one was out, not a single car on the winding roads, not a single soul in sight. The only sign of life was the occasional rustling of wind through the towering oaks and maples, their leaves turning to fire and gold. It felt like she had stepped back in time, into a place forgotten by the world, a place where memories lingered like smoke. Evelyn hadn't known what to expect, but it certainly wasn't this. The house seemed almost out of place, as though it had been built centuries ago and had somehow survived every storm, every earthquake, and every act of time itself. She wondered if her great-aunt had really lived here, or if she had been waiting for someone to take possession of it. The key to the house was old and rusted, turning with a groan in the lock. When she pushed open the door, the musty smell of aged wood and dust hit her like a wave. The foyer was grand, though a bit dim. A large chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dull and coated with years of dust. She stepped inside, the echoes of her footsteps swallowing her up. The air was thick, as if the house had been holding secrets for a long time. Everything about it felt untouched. The furniture was heavy and dark, arranged in perfect symmetry. The walls were lined with ancient portraits, their eyes following her as she moved. In the corner of the room stood an old grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging steadily, as if counting down the seconds. Despite the beauty of the place, there was something unnerving about it. It wasn't the creaking floorboards or the shadows that played tricks on her eyes. It was a feeling, something subtle but palpable, a pressure in the air, as if the house itself was aware of her presence, watching her. The silence was so thick it seemed to have substance, like a living thing pressing against her skin. Evelyn tried to shake the thought. It was just an old house, she reasoned. She was imagining things. She hadn't slept properly in days. A change of scenery would do her good, she reminded herself. She had nothing to fear here. That night she set up her bedroom in what seemed to be the master suite, overlooking the back of the house. The window was large, offering a sweeping view of the trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. The bed was large and heavy, draped in old-fashioned linens. As Evelyn sank into the softness of the sheets, she felt a sense of calm wash over her, at least for a moment. The silence, however, was unrelenting. There were no sounds from outside, no crickets, no breeze rustling the leaves. Nothing, just the relentless ticking of the clock downstairs. She tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Her mind wandered to her great-aunt Marjorie. What kind of woman had she been? And why had she left this place to Evelyn? Had they ever even met? Evelyn's fingers traced the edge of the blanket, the thread soft and fraying beneath her touch. She hadn't known Marjorie, but somehow she felt connected to her. It was as though the house itself held the answers she was searching for, waiting for her to uncover them. As the clock ticked on, Evelyn's eyes fluttered shut, but the silence remained thick and unnerving. She woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something soft, a tap, a knock. It came from upstairs. Her heart jumped in her chest and she sat up, breath caught in her throat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. A knock. She strained her ears, but the house was silent again. The tap had stopped. She lay back down, trying to dismiss the sensation, telling herself it was nothing. A branch, perhaps tapping against the window, or an old floorboard shifting beneath the weight of the house. But the silence in the room was not like any silence she had ever known. It was the kind of silence that waited. The next morning, Evelyn woke to an oppressive silence, the kind of silence that was deeper than the absence of sound. It felt as if the house itself was holding its breath. The sun had barely risen, casting weak light through the fog that clung to the trees outside, and the world seemed muffled, distant. She rubbed her eyes and tried to shake off the remnants of the uneasy dream that had hovered over her sleep. It had been a dream of the house, but it was different. The walls seemed to move, the floors buckled, and the air was thick with shadowy shapes hovering, whispering. At one point, a voice had called to her. Not a human voice, too hollow, too wrong. It had come from deep within the walls, from under the floorboards. She had tried to run, but her feet felt stuck in place, as if the house itself was keeping her there. She frowned, shaking the memory away, and got out of bed. There was work to be done. She couldn't afford to lose herself to fear. She made a mental note to check her phone for a signal later, though she didn't expect much. From the moment she arrived, she had noticed that the town seemed to be trapped in time. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no clear path to the outside world. The house, it seemed, wanted to keep her here. Downstairs, the air was colder than she expected. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and moved to the kitchen, her footsteps soft against the old wooden floors. The place had a strange, unsettled energy to it this morning, as if it was watching her every move. She could almost hear the house groaning with the weight of years. The kitchen was dusty but serviceable, with dark wood cabinets and a heavy cast-iron stove. She found a mug, poured herself some water, and stared out the window, listening to the distant sound of birds. And then she noticed it. Footprints. In the dust. They were small, delicate prints. Bare feet, with distinct toe imprints, and a slight trail of dirt. They started just inside the kitchen by the wooden cabinet, and stretched across the floor toward the door leading out to the back of the house. They were almost perfect, untouched by the rest of the dust that covered the floor, as if someone, something, had walked across the floor, leaving behind a trail of dirt, but had disappeared before they could leave any other trace. Evelyn froze. Her heart raced in her chest as she stared at the prints. They weren't hers. She hadn't walked across the floor barefoot. She had barely touched the ground at all since her arrival, too exhausted to do more than collapse into bed after the long drive. The prints were too clean, too deliberate, as though someone or something had placed them with intention. A shiver ran down her spine. She knelt down and traced the edge of one of the prints with her finger. Cold, too cold. The chill that had been lingering in the house seemed to seep into her bones, and she stood abruptly, wiping her hand on her pants. "No," she whispered to herself. "This doesn't make sense. It's just a draft. It's just dust settling." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The air in the room felt wrong. The footprints, no matter how they appeared, weren't the real problem. It was the sensation that clung to her, that watching feeling that had been with her since she arrived, as though she weren't alone, as though something else was here with her. The day passed in a haze of half-hearted exploration. Evelyn forced herself to venture through the house, trying to familiarize herself with the rooms. The place was larger than she had anticipated, with long, dimly lit hallways and narrow stairs that creaked with every step. The upstairs bedrooms were cold and uninviting, furnished with heavy wooden furniture that seemed to belong in another century. It was the kind of house that felt like it had swallowed years of its own history, trapping it inside these walls. There was a library on the second floor, tucked away behind a pair of old oak doors that she found after several minutes of wandering. The room was dark, with the only light coming from the small window at the far end. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old books, some with titles she could barely make out, others too worn to read at all. It was clear no one had been here in a long time, but then she saw it. A book tucked at an angle on one of the shelves. It looked newer than the others, though still aged. "A Guide to the Occult," the title read. A cold shiver washed over her as she pulled the book from the shelf. The cover was ornate, with strange symbols carved into the leather. The pages inside were yellowed, but they were filled with bizarre diagrams, runes, symbols, and drawings of houses that looked too familiar. At first glance, it seemed like a book of ancient rituals or forgotten lore, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The illustrations seemed to shimmer slightly, like they were alive. She slammed the book shut, feeling her heart race again. "What am I doing?" she thought, forcing herself to take a steady breath. "It's just an old book, nothing more." But the unease lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave her side. That night, as the house sank into its usual suffocating silence, Evelyn found herself unable to sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaks, the groans, the soft whispers that seemed to linger just out of reach. She heard it again, the soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Her heart leapt in her chest as she sat up, eyes darting toward the ceiling. It's upstairs, she thought, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Her thoughts were racing, trying to rationalize it all. She needed to get a grip. The house was old. Old houses made noises. Old houses shifted, but this was different. The tap came again, a little louder this time, followed by a faint shuffle, like footsteps across the floor. Only these footsteps didn't sound human. They sounded wrong. Evelyn jumped from the bed and moved toward the door, her breath shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't want to go up there. She didn't want to face whatever was making those sounds, but she couldn't stay here, alone in the dark, listening to the silence scream at her. With trembling hands, she grabbed the flashlight from her bag and crept out into the hallway. The house seemed to hold its breath again, waiting. The air was thick, pressing in on her. and the only sound was the faint tapping from above. She reached the stairs, her heartbeat drumming in her ears, and took the first step. The house was waiting. The stairs creaked beneath Evelyn's feet as she ascended slowly, the narrow staircase seeming to stretch endlessly before her. The beam of her flashlight quivered in her grasp, throwing long, shifting shadows against the cracked wallpaper that clung to the walls like dead skin. The tap, tap, tap continued, a slow rhythmic sound that seemed to beckon her further into the house, into the unknown. Her breath was shallow, caught between fear and curiosity. Each step felt heavier than the last, her body unwilling but her mind urging her forward. It was as though the house itself was pulling her upward, leading her through its dark, forgotten corridors. The house didn't want to be empty. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dim, lit only by the weak glow of her flashlight. Dust floated in the air, catching the light like fragments of something long lost. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, protesting each step as though the house were alive, reacting, observing. Her skin prickled with an unsettling sensation, like invisible eyes were following her every movement. She reached the end of the hallway and found the door to the attic, a heavy wooden thing, adorned with rusty iron hinges that creaked as she touched it. The faint tapping had stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft low hum. It was almost melodic, a humming vibration that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. It made her head feel foggy, like a dull pressure in her skull. "Just go inside," Evelyn whispered to herself, her voice trembling in the still. She had to see for herself what was up here. The house was full of mysteries, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore them. She turned the handle, and the door swung open with a groan. The attic was even colder than the rest of the house, a biting chill that hit her like an icy wind. The space was vast, and the low, slanted ceiling seemed to trap the cold, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Cobwebs hung in the corners, the long strands swaying slightly in the draft. Boxes and old furniture were scattered throughout the room, piles of forgotten relics that had gathered dust for decades. The walls were lined with shelves, some empty, others packed with boxes that seemed to contain nothing but old papers and brittle books. But it wasn't the clutter that caught Evelyn's attention. It was the mirror. A tall, ornate mirror stood at the far end of the attic, its gilded frame twisted with intricate designs that seemed to crawl like vines. The glass was dark, clouded with age, but it reflected the dim light from her flashlight in strange, shimmering ways. For a moment she thought she saw movement within the reflection, something flickering in the corner of the glass, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She took a hesitant step forward, her pulse quickening. The humming sound had grown louder now, a soft, almost melodic chant, vibrating through the air as though the house itself was alive and singing. The mirror seemed to call to her, its presence so overwhelming that she couldn't tear her eyes away from it. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her closer to the dark reflection. And then she saw it. There, behind her in the mirror, was a figure. It was vague at first, just a blur of shadow, as though the glass had captured something out of the corner of her eye. But as she moved closer, the shape became clearer. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing in the center of the room. Its form was distorted, like a silhouette pulled from a dream. It had no face, just a dark void where features should have been. But the shape was undeniably human. Its arms hung at its sides, its posture stiff, unnatural. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. She whipped around, but the attic was empty. No figure, no movement. Nothing but the cold, oppressive air. The mirror. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly turned back toward it. The figure was still there, staring at her from the glass. It didn't move. It just watched. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached out to touch the mirror's surface, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. It felt strange, too smooth, too cold. The humming sound intensified, vibrating in her bones. And then, she felt it. A sensation, like fingers brushing against her own, except there was no one there. The mirror reacted. It seemed to ripple under her touch, the surface of the glass shifting like water disturbed by a stone. For a moment the room seemed to blur, and then without warning the mirror flared bright, its surface cracking with a sharp, terrible sound. Evelyn stumbled backward, her heart racing. She cried out as the glass shattered in front of her, the pieces falling to the floor in a soft rain of jagged shards. The attic was silent once more. It took several minutes for Evelyn to gather herself, standing there in the aftermath, staring at the broken mirror. Her fingers still tingled, as if the sensation of being touched by something that wasn't there hadn't quite faded. The humming had stopped, leaving behind a ringing silence. Something had changed, but what? The broken mirror, the odd sensation in her fingertips and that figure. Those things weren't just tricks of the mind. They were real. She could feel it deep in her gut, a certainty that crawled under her skin. The house knew. It knew her. It had been waiting for her. The attic felt colder than ever. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine and, without thinking, turned toward the stairs. She couldn't stay up here any longer. Something was wrong, something deeply wrong, and the air in the attic was thick with it. The walls seemed to press in on her, the shadows growing darker with every passing second. The house was alive, shifting and breathing around her. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something on the far side of the room. A small wooden box, half hidden beneath a pile of old rags. It was unremarkable. Small and plain, with no markings or identifying features. But it seemed out of place amidst the chaos of the attic, as if it had been deliberately tucked away. Against her better judgment, Evelyn walked over and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, the lid tightly sealed. She ran her fingers over the worn wood, feeling a strange heat radiating from it despite the chill of the room. A whisper, almost imperceptible, fluttered through the air. It was faint, but it was there. Open it. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the box, her breath shallow, her hand hovering over the lid. Something deep inside her urged her to put it down, to turn away, to leave the attic and never come back. But the house wouldn't let her. The house wanted her to open it. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she held the wooden box in her hands, the sensation of its heat growing more intense with every passing second. The faint whispering from the air had settled in her bones now, a soft murmur that threaded through her mind like 1,000 secrets, all tangled and waiting to be uncovered. She couldn't remember when she had decided to open it. All she knew was that the pull was undeniable. Like an invisible force was urging her to lift the lid. The humming sound had returned too, low and distant, reverberating through her chest, like the echo of a heartbeat in the walls. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, and the darkness seemed to stretch deeper, pressing against her. The box was warm, too warm, as if something inside it was alive. She hesitated for a moment, a fleeting doubt gnawing at the edge of her mind. But the whisper, the voice that had been calling to her, growing louder and clearer in the silence, pushed her forward. Open it. The lid creaked as she lifted it, her heart thudding in her ears. The moment the box opened, a cold gust of air swept across the attic, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The inside of the box was lined with velvet, deep crimson in color. At first glance it seemed empty, nothing more than a container for dust and time. But there, nestled at the bottom, was something that made her blood run cold. A small, delicate pendant. It shimmered in the faint light, a dark stone set in a web of silver filigree, its design intricate and unnervingly beautiful. It looked old, ancient even. The stone was dark, almost black, but it gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse as though it was alive. She felt drawn to it, her fingers moving on their own accord, reaching for the pendant. The moment she touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through her, sharp and blinding. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows warping and twisting as if the very air itself were bending around her. A sharp, deafening scream filled her ears. No, not a scream. A cry. A cry that echoed in her mind, filling her thoughts with pain and sorrow. And then, as quickly as it came, it stopped. The room returned to its stillness, the shadows settling back into their corners. Evelyn's hand shook as she held the pendant, the heat from the stone still burning through her skin. For a long moment she simply stood there, staring at it in her palm. She couldn't explain what had just happened, what she had felt. It was as though the very act of touching the pendant had woken something inside her, something dark and ancient that now seemed to stir within her chest. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that came after. A cold, oppressive weight settling in her gut. Like the house was watching her more intently now, its walls closing in, its breath heavy and expectant. She could feel it in the air, like a presence, an invisible force just on the edge of her vision. And that's when she heard it. Soft, like a whisper, but unmistakable. You shouldn't have touched it. Evelyn froze. Her heart seemed to stop, and for a moment she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. The words had come from nowhere. No one was in the attic with her. She was alone. Yet the voice, low and gravelly, had been real. So real that it vibrated in her bones. She spun around, the flashlight's beam sweeping across the attic. But there was no one. Only the forgotten relics, the dust, and the shadows. The voice had come from within her head. Her breath was shallow now, her pulse quickening. The house had said something. It had spoken to her. She stumbled backward, dropping the pendant back into the box as though it were on fire. The whisper continued, swirling in the back of her mind, becoming more insistent, more urgent. You shouldn't have touched it, it's too late now. It has you. Evelyn shook her head, clutching the edges of the box as though it might fall apart in her hands. She couldn't think. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on her like they were closing up, ready to swallow her whole. The temperature in the attic dropped suddenly, her breath becoming visible in the cold air. The whisper turned into a murmur, a chant almost, rising in volume until it became unintelligible. She could hear it all around her, thick and heavy, like a storm of voices converging in on her, drowning her out. And then, through the noise, she heard something else, something that cut through the chaos. A sound. A soft tap, 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 tap. The noise came from the far corner of the attic. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes locked onto the place where the sound was coming from. The shadowed corner near the broken mirror. No, not the corner. The mirror. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her throat. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as the shadows in the corner seemed to shift, as though something were moving just beyond the reach of her light. Her flashlight flickered once, twice, and then the beam went out completely, leaving her in darkness. Her breath hitched. It's coming. Without thinking, Evelyn bolted from the attic, the box and its pendant abandoned in the middle of the room. Her footfalls were frantic, echoing through the narrow hallway as she stumbled toward the stairs. She could still hear the whispers, but they were fading, now replaced with that same rhythmic tap. It was getting closer, closer with every beat, like footsteps in the dark, following her. She reached the stairs, but before she could turn to descend, the air shifted again. There was a weight to it now, a pressure like someone, or something, was standing right behind her. She could feel it, a coldness creeping into her bones, a sense of something ancient and powerful moving through the air like smoke. The tap. It was right behind her. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she spun around, half expecting to find the figure from the mirror standing there. But there was nothing. Only darkness, and the oppressive feeling that she was no longer alone. The house had changed. She could feel it now. It was alive, alive in a way that wasn't natural. It was as if the house itself had become aware of her presence, of her every thought, every breath. It had been waiting for her, pulling her in with whispers and shadows. And now it had her. Evelyn bolted down the stairs, her legs shaking with fear, her mind consumed with panic. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she needed to get out, needed to escape. But the house wouldn't let her. The front door was locked, and the air was growing thick with the oppressive pressure, the heavy sensation of unseen eyes watching her. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think. The house was holding her, keeping her in place, and that was when she realized the truth. The house didn't want to let her go. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her throat as she scrambled down the stairs, her feet unsteady on the old wood, the walls of the house seeming to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Every step felt heavier, as if the house itself was dragging her downward, holding her in place. The air was thick with dread, and the feeling that something was waiting for her in the dark corner of the hallway grew stronger with each passing moment. Her fingers brushed the cold brass handle of the front door, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked at it, twisting and pulling in a frantic panic, but it remained stubbornly locked, the sound of the deadbolt clicking echoing in her ears like a final warning. She didn't know what to do. The weight of the house, of the presence that now clung to her, was suffocating. The shadows stretched longer, deeper, twisting into shapes that didn't belong in the corners of her vision. And that tap, that relentless tapping had returned, echoing in the walls, now coming from every direction. It's here. Evelyn backed away from the door, her chest tight with fear. She had to find another way out, another way to escape this nightmare. She turned, scanning the hallway, the dim light from the cracked windows casting eerie shadows across the floor. A soft creak behind her made her jump, but when she looked, there was nothing there, nothing except the heavy, oppressive silence that had settled over everything. Her gaze fell on a door at the far end of the hall, one she hadn't noticed before. It was different from the others. Its wood was darker, the brass handle unusually ornate, almost too polished compared to the rest of the house's neglect. It looked new, out of place in a house that had been abandoned for decades. The tap came. Again, tap, 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 closer this time. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. The door seemed to beckon to her, pulling her forward against her will. There was something compelling about it, like it was meant for her, like it had been waiting for her to find it. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to open it, but her legs moved before she could think, her hand reaching for the handle. The moment her fingers made contact, the air shifted. The shadows around her seemed to recoil, as if the door itself had been a barrier, and now it was opening something else, something worse. She twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The room was unlike any other she had seen in the house. It was small, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But what made the room so disturbing wasn't the faint light or the worn walls. It was the furniture. The room was packed with old chairs, tables, and chests, all facing a single, solitary chair in the center. But it wasn't just the furniture that made Evelyn's skin crawl. It was the walls. The walls were covered in old, faded photographs. Thousands of them. They were tacked up haphazardly, some crooked, some torn. Each image was black and white, depicting faces she didn't recognize, strangers from another time. But the faces, there was something wrong about them. Their eyes, though frozen in time, seemed to follow her every movement, the gazes sharp, unblinking, as if watching her, as if they knew. Her heart skipped a beat. Her throat tightened with an unexplainable fear, a dread so deep it felt like the walls were closing in around her. She stepped into the room, her feet hesitant, her breath shallow. The door behind her creaked shut, its sound too final, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The noise was louder now, closer. The air felt colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as she stepped further into the room. She walked slowly toward the center, where the single chair sat, and then froze. On the seat of the chair was a small object, a photograph. It was one of the same faded black and white photos that covered the walls, but this one was different. It was of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at the camera with a look of sheer terror. Evelyn's stomach churned as she realized the woman in the photograph was not just any stranger. It was her. The photo was old, much older than Evelyn could have possibly been. Yet the face, her face, was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same face framed by dark hair. Though the image was warped and faded with time, the woman in the photo looked as though she had been through something unspeakable. Her expression was one of fear, as though she were trapped in a nightmare. She couldn't escape. Evelyn felt as though the floor had dropped out beneath her. Her pulse quickened and she took a step back, her eyes never leaving the photo. No, it couldn't be her. Couldn't. But there was no denying it. The resemblance was undeniable. This woman in the photograph is me. She reached down to pick it up, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the photo. The moment she touched it, a sharp, icy cold shot up her arm and the lights in the room flickered violently, casting the walls into deep shifting shadows. A sharp, ear-piercing bang made her jump and the room seemed to shake. The shadows in the room grew darker. The eyes of the people in the photograph seemed to bulge out of their frames, watching her, screaming without sound. And then she heard it again, closer this time. "You're here." The whisper was clear this time, a low, guttural voice rising from the darkness like something alive. She spun around, her eyes darting across the room. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the photographs. The faces in the photos were no longer still. The figures, frozen in time, were now moving, slowly, grotesquely. They shifted as though the very act of looking at them brought them to life. Their faces twisted with pain, their eyes bulging with terror. They were reaching out from the frames, their mouths open as if calling her name. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She felt something cold and sharp press against her neck, the unmistakable sensation of fingers curling around her skin. Panic surged through her, her legs unsteady as she backed toward the door. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered again, too close now, right in her ear. She spun around, ready to run, but the door, it was gone. The hallway was empty. The walls were closing in. Evelyn's scream was swallowed by the house. The walls, thick and oppressive, seemed to absorb the sound, dampening it until there was nothing but silence. She stood there, gasping for breath, her hands pressed against her ears as if to block out the voice that still whispered in her mind. The weight of the house bore down on her, suffocating, like something ancient and alive had wrapped itself, around her, pulling her in. She blinked, trying to focus, but the room was spinning. The faces in the photographs, those eyes, those mouths, were still shifting, still alive. The walls seemed to breathe, the air thick with something unseen, something sinister. She could feel it, deep in her bones, like the house was waiting for her to break. Evelyn's chest tightened as the air grew colder, colder than before. Her breath came out in short bursts, visible in the dim light. She backed up against the far wall, her eyes darting around the room. She was trapped. There was no door, no exit, nothing but the oppressive presence of the house closing in on her. And then, the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, echoing through the floor, vibrating the walls. The sound was everywhere, coming from every direction. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them. The figures in the photographs, their hollow eyes locked onto her, their bodies now contorted, stretching unnaturally. "You can't leave." The whisper rang through the room again, cold and guttural, crawling under her skin. It felt like the house itself was speaking to her, like the walls, the floors, the very foundation were alive. Aware, alive with malice. "You can never leave." Her heart skipped a beat. Panic surged in her chest, and for a moment, she felt the room close in on her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, like it was being pulled into the air, into the shadows. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She had to think. She had to do something. The pendant. Her fingers brushed against her neck, and the cold metal of the pendant pressed against her skin. She had forgotten about it. The stone. It pulsed faintly, a subtle warmth in the cold air, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. "You shouldn't have touched it." The voice was louder now. It was no longer a whisper, it was a command, a warning. She could feel it in her chest, in her gut. The house knew. It knew she had taken the pendant. It knew she had opened the box. It was all part of the plan, part of the pull, the lure. The house was not just a house, it was a trap. A living, breathing thing with desires, with needs, and it was hungry. Evelyn stumbled forward, her eyes locking onto the photographs. They weren't just photographs. They were doors, portals to something else. She could feel it, the way the images seemed to reach out to her, their eyes following her every movement. No, she couldn't stay in here. She had to find a way out. She had to. The room shifted. It wasn't just the air. It wasn't just the walls pressing in on her. The very space around her seemed to distort, as though reality itself was being twisted, warped. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, the room had changed. The photographs were gone. Instead, the walls were lined with doors. Dozens of doors, each one different. Some were wooden, others metal. Some were small, others enormous, like the doors to another world. And each door had a name carved into it. Evelyn. The name on the nearest door was hers. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her legs unsteady, the air around her thick with dread. The name had been carved deeply into the wood, as though someone, or something, had etched it with a knife. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. The moment she touched it, a flash of light exploded in her vision. And for a second, the world spun wildly. The light was blinding and she staggered back, her heart pounding. The air vibrated with energy, and the tap, tap, tap sounded once more, louder than ever. The house was alive. It was changing. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. What was behind the door? Was it the way out? Or was it something worse? Open it. The voice echoed in her mind again, clear and unmistakable. She didn't want to. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee, to escape from whatever this was. But she had no choice. The house wouldn't let her leave. The doors, those doors, were calling her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the door handle once again. With a sharp twist, the door creaked open. Behind it was a hallway, long and narrow, lined with more doors, hundreds of vios, them stretching as far as the eye could see. The walls were adorned with old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. It smelled musty, like something had been locked away for decades. The hallway stretched on endlessly, as though the house itself had no end. The air was thick with the feeling of being trapped, of being led somewhere she didn't want to go. The tapping sound echoed through the hall, louder and more insistent than ever. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, from the darkness beyond. It's waiting. She felt the house pulling her forward, toward the darkness. She tried to resist, but the walls seemed to shift with each step she took, guiding her deeper into the bowels of the house. She was moving against her will now, her body acting on its own, as though the house itself were possessing her. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. It was different from all the others. Its wood was dark, polished, almost new. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like there was something beyond it. A presence, a thing that was waiting. Evelyn's heart stopped. The door was calling to her. The whispers grew louder. She stepped forward, her legs heavy, the tapping noise growing in time with her heartbeat. The door loomed closer, and as she reached for the handle, she felt the coldness of the air seep into her skin. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. Behind it there was nothing, just blackness, but the voice, it was there again. Welcome home. Evelyn stood in the doorway, staring into the suffocating blackness beyond. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest as if it were trying to break free. The air was colder now, colder than it had been moments before, and the darkness in front of her felt alive, as though it were waiting for her to step into it, to surrender herself to whatever was lurking inside. The door creaked again, closing slowly behind her with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. She spun around, but it was too late. The door had disappeared. There was no handle, no exit. The hallway was gone, and she was alone with the dark. The whispers, soft at first, began again. They were faint, like the distant rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, closer, until they surrounded her. Voices, hundreds of them, all murmuring at once, a chorus of agony and despair. You're not alone. The words pierced through the whispers like a knife. Evelyn's blood ran cold, her breath catching in her throat. She stepped backward, but the darkness pressed in on her from all sides. There was nowhere to go. The voices didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to be coming closer, crawling under her skin, wrapping around her mind, pulling her into their frenzy. But amidst the chaos, she heard something else. A sound, a shift in the air, a subtle movement in the blackness. Tap. Debus tap. It came from deep within the room. The noise was too familiar, the rhythm too deliberate. It wasn't just the house that was alive. Something else was in here with her. Something old, something hungry. Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine. The tapping was getting louder, faster, until it seemed like the sound was right next to her, reverberating off the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The darkness seemed to pulse, as though something was moving in it, something that was just beyond her reach. She strained her eyes, trying to see something, anything, but the darkness was absolute. There were no shapes, no shadows, no hint of form, just the oppressive, suffocating black. And then she saw it. A faint glimmer, just a spark of light, like a pair of eyes flickering in the distance. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. But when she opened her eyes again, the light was gone. The blackness pressed even closer now, the walls narrowing around her, crushing her with its weight. "You're here." The whisper was low but unmistakable. It came from everywhere. It came from the walls, from the floor, from the very air. It surrounded her, squeezing her chest, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. Then, another. Always a sharp click, followed by another. And then another. Evelyn's eyes shot to the dark space ahead of her. She could feel them now. Eyes. Watching her from the shadows. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. In the blackness, she could see movement. Flickering, like shadows shifting in and out of focus. There were eyes there. Hundreds of them. Eyes staring at her from the dark, wide and unblinking. And they were getting closer. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized something. They weren't just eyes. They were bodies, hidden in the darkness, barely visible. But there. Their shapes, distorted and twisted, hovered just at the edge of her vision. She could feel them creeping forward, moving toward her. Tap, tap, tap. The noise grew louder, each strike of the tap like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, and filled with malice. Evelyn wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen, her limbs heavy, her mind clouded with fear. And then the eyes blinked. One by one, they blinked in unison, and the room shuddered. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice, now clear and commanding, rumbled through the air like a low growl. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the whispers. It was something else, something ancient and terrifying that had been waiting, hidden in the dark. Something was awake. The room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of a great beast. And the eyes, those cold, unfeeling eyes, blinked again, closer this time. The shapes behind them moved, shifting like shadows in the periphery of her sight. Their forms twisted, barely human, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. A sudden, gut-wrenching pull seized Evelyn, yanking her forward. She stumbled, her feet dragging across the cold, hard floor. The eyes followed, watching, waiting. The tapping grew louder, more urgent, now a cacophony of rhythmic pounding. "No, please, no." The voice, once so clear, was now distorted, twisted, as though it were being spoken from a mouth that didn't belong to anything human. Evelyn's head spun, the darkness seeming to close in tighter, until it felt as if the room itself was suffocating her. With a burst of adrenaline, she wrenched herself forward, blindly stumbling through the blackness. She couldn't see, couldn't think, but her instincts screamed at her to move. She had to move. Then her hand brushed against something. Cold. Solid. A door. Her heart leaped. She twisted the handle, throwing herself into the space beyond it. She didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. She had to get away from the eyes, from the thing that was hunting her. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and for a moment she felt nothing but the pounding of her heart in her ears. But the whispering didn't stop. The tapping didn't stop. The feeling of being watched didn't stop. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door. She was in another room, another empty room, cold and dim, lit by a single flickering light bulb. The walls were bare, the air stale. But she was not alone, not anymore. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and in the corner of her eye she saw movement, something shifting. She turned to look, her eyes wide, her body frozen in terror. The darkness was coming, and now it had her. Evelyn's body shook with terror as she stepped into the dimly lit room, her pulse racing. The light bulb flickered above her, casting shadows that danced erratically across the walls. each one stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. The air felt heavier here, thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned, scanning the empty room. The walls were bare, save for the peeling yellowed wallpaper that seemed to crawl toward the corners like it was trying to escape. But it was the floor that caught her attention. The floorboards were cracked and warped, as though something had been moving underneath them, something that had been waiting. She took a cautious step forward, her footfall causing a low creak to echo in the stillness. It felt like the room was holding its breath, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. But the silence stretched on, and all Evelyn could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her chest. Then, as she moved deeper into the room, she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief movement at the corner of her vision, like a shadow darting across the wall. But when she turned to face it directly, she saw the outline of a figure in the farthest corner, barely illuminated by the flickering bulb. A shape, too faint to fully make out, but unmistakably there. She froze. The air turned cold, colder than before, as a chill seeped deep into her bones. The figure shifted, its form twisting and warping in the dim light. It was like trying to focus on a shape that was always just out of reach, always just beyond understanding. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound echoed again, but this time it wasn't just coming from the walls. It was coming from the figure itself. It was tapping against the floor, its movements deliberate, its rhythm unnatural, as though it had been doing this for years, perhaps longer. Evelyn felt the room tighten around her, the walls leaning in as if the space was closing, folding itself in on her. The shadows seemed to stretch, growing longer and deeper, closing off her escape. She could feel it now, the presence. It was in the air, in the floor, in the walls. The house wasn't just alive, it was watching her, listening to her every move. And it wasn't alone. A sudden whisper shot through the room like a knife. The voice was faint at first, distant, like the echo of a long-forgotten memory. "You've opened the door." Evelyn whipped around, looking for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. The room was still empty, still cold. But the voice continued, its tone dripping with something ancient, something powerful. "You've woken it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't understand. But there was no time to think. The thing in the corner was moving closer now, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Every step it took seemed to echo with the tap, tap, tap of its hands against the floorboards. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away, stumbling toward the door. Her fingers brushed the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was stuck, locked in place as if something was holding it shut from the other side. "You're not going anywhere," the voice again. This time it wasn't just in her head. It was clear. It was real. She spun around, her eyes wide with panic. The figure in the corner was no longer a shapeless blur. It was now a solid form, its body pale and gaunt, its skin stretched tight across its bones. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were wrong. Too thin, too long. The eyes, empty black pits, stared at her from deep within the sockets, unblinking. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, she couldn't scream. She was frozen in place, trapped in the room with this thing. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping had grown louder, faster. It was coming from the figure's hands, but now it seemed to be coming from the walls as well. The room seemed to vibrate with the noise, like the very structure of the house was trembling, as if it were alive, as if it were feeding off the fear that churned in her stomach. The figure reached up slowly, its skeletal fingers brushing the side of its face as though it were trying to remember how to speak. It opened its mouth, but there was no sound. Only a horrible dry rasp as its jaw moved like it was trying to speak, trying to say something that it had been holding inside for far too long. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was clearer now, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the air around her. The thing in the corner tilted its head, its empty eyes never leaving her. It was alive, in some twisted, horrible way. It wasn't the house that was pulling her in. It was this thing. It had been here long before her, long before the house, long before everything. Evelyn stepped back, her body moving on its own as she tried to escape. But the figure wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. More shapes began to appear, creatures, shadows, figures too distorted to make sense of. They began to gather, their eyes fixed on her, the tapping sound growing louder. She turned to the door once again, desperately twisting the handle, but it remained locked. She was trapped, and the room was closing in on her. The walls were shifting, narrowing, bending, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The thing in the corner began to move again, its body twitching and jerking in a way that made Evelyn's stomach churn. Then, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a vibration she could barely feel. But it grew stronger, the house itself shaking as if something deep below had awakened. Something massive and terrible, reaching up to claim her. "You can't leave." The voice wasn't just one now. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, all coming from the shadows, from the walls, from the very air. The house wasn't just alive anymore. It was a prison, a tomb, and Evelyn was its prisoner. She turned back to the door in a final desperate attempt to escape, but something stopped her. Something invisible, like a wall made of air, pushed against her chest, forcing her back into the center of the room. The creatures in the shadows began to step forward, slowly, relentlessly. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness. Tap, 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 and then with a sickening crack, the walls of the room seemed to split open, revealing the true darkness beneath. A darkness so deep, so absolute, that it swallowed everything. The creatures, the whispers, the shadows, and Evelyn. Evelyn's body tensed as the darkness consumed her, the room around her collapsing into a void so absolute that it seemed to devour all sense of time and space. Her heart thundered in her chest as she gasped for air, but the very atmosphere felt like it was being drained from her lungs. The weight of it pressed against her, thick and oppressive, as though the darkness had a physical form, something that could reach out and crush her. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but there was no light, no flicker, just a suffocating blackness that seemed to have no end, no beginning, just an endless abyss. And then, she felt it. It was a slow pressure at first, something that began deep inside her, at the core of her being. A pull, faint but undeniable. The pull of something ancient, something alive. It came from deep beneath the floor, like roots sinking into the earth, like hands clawing their way upward toward her. It was coming for her. The shadows shifted. They weren't still. They moved. They watched. Evelyn didn't know how much time passed, maybe seconds, maybe hours. But as she stood frozen in the void, the oppressive darkness seemed to grow even deeper, as though it was aware of her every breath, her every thought. The walls of reality were slipping away, and she was falling into the pit of the house itself. The tapping began again, not from the walls, not from the figures she had seen before, but from beneath her feet. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was maddening, faster now, more frantic, like something was digging, burrowing its way up through the earth toward her. The sound was too loud, too close, vibrating the air, the ground, her very bones. Evelyn's mind felt like it was unraveling. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. The pull grew stronger, more insistent. It was as though the house had come, alive. Its very foundation alive with a hunger, a need. Something that could not be sated. And the deeper it pulled her, the more she could feel it. Feel the creature beneath. The thing that had been waiting for so long. Her breath caught in her throat. A shape emerged from the dark. It was massive, its form barely discernible in the pitch-black void. But there was something undeniable about it. Something wrong. It moved closer, slow and deliberate. Its presence suffocating, like a predator stalking its prey. And then, it spoke. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door. She was in another room. Another empty room, cold and dim, lit by a single flickering light bulb. The walls were bare, the air stale. But she was not alone. Not anymore. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and in the corner of her eye she saw movement, something shifting. She turned to look, her eyes wide, her body frozen in terror. The darkness was coming, and now it had her. Evelyn's body shook with terror as she stepped into the dimly lit room, her pulse racing. The light bulb flickered above her, casting shadows that danced erratically across the walls, each one stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. The air felt heavier here, thick with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned, scanning the empty room. The walls were bare, save for the peeling yellowed wallpaper that seemed to crawl toward the corners like it was trying to escape. But it was the floor that caught her attention. The floorboards were cracked and warped, as though something had been moving underneath them, something that had been waiting. She took a cautious step forward, her footfall causing a low creak to echo in the stillness. It felt like the room was holding its breath, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. But the silence stretched on, and all Evelyn could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her chest. Then, as she moved deeper into the room, she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief movement at the corner of her vision, like a shadow darting across the wall. But when she turned to face it directly, she saw the outline of a figure in the farthest corner, barely illuminated by the flickering bulb. A shape, too faint to fully make out, but unmistakably there. She froze. The air turned cold, colder than before as a chill seeped deep into her bones. The figure shifted, its form twisting and warping in the dim light. It was like trying to focus on a shape that was always just out of reach, always just beyond understanding. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound echoed again, but this time it wasn't just coming from the walls. It was coming from the figure itself. It was tapping against the floor, its movements deliberate, its rhythm unnatural, as though it had been doing this for years, perhaps longer. Evelyn felt the room tighten around her, the walls leaning in as if the space was closing, folding itself in on her. The shadows seemed to stretch, growing longer and deeper, closing off her escape. She could feel it now, the presence. It was in the air, in the floor, in the walls. The house wasn't just alive, it was watching her, listening to her every move. And it wasn't alone. A sudden whisper shot through the room like a knife. The voice was faint at first, distant, like the echo of a long-forgotten memory. "You've opened the door." Evelyn whipped around, looking for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. The room was still empty, still cold. But the voice continued, its tone dripping with something ancient, something powerful. "You've woken it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't understand. But there was no time to think. The thing in the corner was moving closer now, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Every step it took seemed to echo with the tap-tap-tap of its hands against the floorboards. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away, stumbling toward the door. Her fingers brushed the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was stuck, locked in place as if something was holding it shut from the other side. "You're not going anywhere," the voice again. This time it wasn't just in her head. It was clear. It was real. She spun around, her eyes wide with panic. The figure in the corner was no longer a shapeless blur. It was now a solid form, its body pale and gaunt, its skin stretched tight across its bones. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were wrong. Too thin, too long. The eyes, empty black pits, stared at her from deep within the sockets, unblinking. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, she couldn't scream. She was frozen in place, trapped in the room with this thing. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping had grown louder, faster. It was coming from the figure's hands, but now it seemed to be coming from the walls as well. The room seemed to vibrate with the noise, like the very structure of the house was trembling, as if it were alive, as if it were feeding off the fear that churned in her stomach. The figure reached up slowly, its skeletal fingers brushing the side of its face as though it were trying to remember how to speak. It opened its mouth, but there was no sound. Only a horrible dry rasp as its jaw moved like it was trying to speak, trying to say something that it had been holding inside for far too long. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was clearer now, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the air around her. The thing in the corner tilted its head, its empty eyes never leaving her. It was alive, in some twisted, horrible way. It wasn't the house that was pulling her in. It was this thing. It had been here long before. Her, long before the house, long before everything. Evelyn stepped back, her body moving on its own as she tried to escape. But the figure wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. More shapes began to appear, creatures, shadows, figures too distorted to make sense of. They began to gather, their eyes fixed on her, the tapping sound growing louder. She turned to the door once again, desperately twisting the handle, but it remained locked. She was trapped, and the room was closing in on her. The walls were shifting, narrowing, bending, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The thing in the corner began to move again, its body twitching and jerking in a way that made Evelyn's stomach churn. Then, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a vibration she could barely feel. But it grew stronger, the house itself shaking as if something deep below had awakened, something massive and terrible, reaching up to claim her. "You can't leave." The voice wasn't just one now. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, all coming from the shadows, from the walls, from the very air. The house wasn't just alive anymore. It was a prison, a tomb, and Evelyn was its prisoner. She turned back to the door in a final desperate attempt to escape, but something stopped her. Something invisible, like a wall made of air, pushed against her chest, forcing her back into the center of the room. The creatures in the shadows began to step forward, slowly, relentlessly. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness. Tap, 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 and then with a sickening crack, the walls of the room seemed to split open, revealing the true darkness beneath. A darkness so deep, so absolute, that it swallowed everything. The creatures, the whispers, the shadows, and Evelyn. Evelyn's body tensed as the darkness consumed her. the room around her collapsing into a void so absolute that it seemed to devour all sense of time and space. Her heart thundered in her chest as she gasped for air, but the very atmosphere felt like it was being drained from her lungs. The weight of it pressed against her, thick and oppressive, as though the darkness had a physical form, something that could reach out and crush her. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but there was no light, no flicker, just a suffocating blackness that seemed to have no end, no beginning, just an endless abyss. And then she felt it. It was a slow pressure at first, something that began deep inside her, at the core of her being. A pull, faint but undeniable. The pull of something ancient, something alive. It came from deep beneath the floor, like roots sinking into the earth, like hands clawing their way upward toward her. It was coming for her. The shadows shifted. They weren't still. They moved. They watched. Evelyn didn't know how much time passed, maybe seconds, maybe hours. But as she stood frozen in the void, the oppressive darkness seemed to grow even deeper, as though it was aware of her every breath, her every thought. The walls of reality were slipping away, and she was falling into the pit of the house itself. The tapping began again, not from the walls, not from the figures she had seen before, but from beneath her feet. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was maddening, faster now, more frantic, like something was digging, burrowing its way up through the earth toward her. The sound was too loud, too close, vibrating the air, the ground, her very bones. Evelyn's mind felt like it was unraveling. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. The pull grew stronger, more insistent. It was as though the house had come, alive, its very foundation alive with a hunger, a need, something that could not be sated. And the deeper it pulled her, the more she could feel it. Feel the creature beneath, the thing that had been waiting for so long. Her breath caught in her throat. A shape emerged from the dark. It was massive, its form barely discernible in the pitch-black void. But there was something undeniable about it, something wrong. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, its presence suffocating, like a predator stalking its prey. And then it spoke. The voice was low, like the grinding of stone against stone, deep and rumbling, filling the space with its weight. "You shouldn't have come here, child." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar. Familiar in the way an old nightmare feels familiar, like something buried in the back of her mind, forgotten but never truly gone. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the walls, the same voice she had heard in the hallway. The voice of the house. No, not just the house, the thing beneath. She forced her legs to move, but every step felt like wading through thick, oppressive mud. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, the floor warping, bending as if the house was alive, reacting to her presence. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The void stretched on forever. "You're part of it now." The voice again, closer now, so close that Evelyn could almost feel it wrapping around her, pulling her into its grip. The air thickened, a pressure built up in the room, like the weight of 1,000 years of trapped silence. The house had been waiting, watching, and now it had her. It had caught her, and there was no escape. The tapping sound reached its peak, the rhythm chaotic and erratic now, as though the house itself was trembling in anticipation. Evelyn turned around, her eyes desperately searching for an escape, a way out, but there was nothing. Just endless blackness, suffocating and all-encompassing. She could feel the house pulling at her skin, crawling under it, as if it were a part. Duver now. And then the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A horrible grinding noise filled the air as the earth split, and from the deep, unfathomable darkness below, something rose. The creature, the thing that had been waiting, pushed its way up through the cracked floor, its massive form sprawling into the void, its shape indistinct but monstrous. It was all movement, a mass of limbs and tendrils that seemed to flow and shift in ways that defied logic. Its presence filled the room like a wave, pushing against the very air Evelyn breathed. And the eyes, thousands of eyes, black, empty, unblinking eyes stared at her from every surface, from every shadow, from every crack in the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. Their gaze was suffocating, infinite. They were the eyes of the house, the eyes of the creature that had been waiting for her. It was alive. It had always been alive, and now it was awake. You belonged to it now. The voice was louder, almost deafening. It was all around her, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. From everywhere. Evelyn couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She could only watch as the creature's tendrils reached for her, the shadows twisting around her legs, pulling her downward, pulling her in. The light above her flickered one last time, casting a fleeting, horrible glimpse of the creature's full form. A grotesque, writhing mass of limbs and eyes. Its head a mass of twisted faces that screamed silently at her from beneath its surface. And beneath the cacophony of its movements, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices, lost and hungry. "You can never leave." The words echoed through her mind, but they weren't just words. They were a promise, a curse. The house had claimed her, and there was no escape. Evelyn's senses were overwhelmed. The house, once just a structure of wood and stone, had become something alive, something terrible. The walls pressed in around her, the air thick and suffocating. The tapping sound, the voices, the terrible weight of the presence beneath the earth. It was all converging into one unrelenting force. She struggled to breathe, but every inhale felt like a betrayal of her own body. The stench of decay, of something ancient and foul, filled her nostrils. It was the smell of rot, of death, and it was everywhere. The creature's tendrils wrapped around her legs now, pulling her deeper into the ground, deeper into the abyss that had opened beneath her. It was too late. The creature that had once lurked in the shadows, the one whose eyes had watched her with hunger, had fully emerged now. Its form was a mass of writhing limbs, its surface covered with wriggling faces, mouths, and eyes, each face twisted in eternal agony. Its form was indistinguishable from the darkness, its shape an amorphous nightmare of endless movement. It whispered in her mind, the voices merging into one. "You are ours now. You are part of this place. You will never leave." Evelyn tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the choking darkness around her. Her body fought against the pull of the creature's tendrils, but it was hopeless. The more she struggled, the stronger it became. She could feel the ground beneath her shift, feel the house itself breathing, as though it were a living entity, its pulse quickening, its hunger growing. Her limbs were heavy. Every movement was met with resistance, as though the very air had turned to tar. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that it seemed to fill the space with its rhythm. Loud, frantic, and desperate. No, she thought, her mind clinging to the last shred of defiance. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let it claim her. And yet, as the darkness closed in, as the creature's writhing tendrils tightened around her, Evelyn knew she had no choice. It was inevitable. She had opened the door, had disturbed the slumber of the thing beneath. Now it was awake, and it would not let her go. With a final heart-wrenching cry, she collapsed, sinking deeper into the earth, into the grip of the house. The last thing she felt was the cold pressure of the walls pressing against her, the tendrils of the creature pulling her into the void. The darkness swallowed her whole, and in that darkness, Evelyn understood. The house wasn't just a structure, it was alive. It had always been alive. And now it would never let her leave. She wasn't the first to be claimed, and she wouldn't be the last. In the end, the house would have them all. The wind howled through the trees surrounding the house, as it always did. The ancient structure stood silent against the storm, its windows dark, its doors sealed shut. The house had always been there, waiting. waiting for the next soul to wander too close to open the wrong door. But Evelyn was not the first to be consumed, nor would she be the last. Inside the house, deep in the labyrinth of rooms and corridors that seemed to go on forever, the darkness had claimed another, and the tapping, always the tapping, could still be heard.